Good morning and welcome to the 7th Capitalism and Morality Seminar. My name is Jayant Bhandari and I'm the co-host of this seminar. I want to start with a short story here. Mahatma Gandhi was once asked by a journalist, a Western journalist. The question was, what do you think about the Western civilization? Gandhi was supposed to have famously replied, I think it would be a good idea. Now, given the huge deification and propaganda behind Gandhi, I find it extremely difficult to know what the truth really was behind Gandhi. I'm certainly no fan of Gandhi and hold a low opinion of him. The irony is that most of these so-called, and I'm using the word so-called, freedom fighters in India, and many of those other so-called freedom fighters in other colonized countries had studied in Europe. They then brought back with them, once they returned back to their homeland, half-cooked ideas about liberty. It pays to remember, albeit it's extremely difficult for the Western mind to understand this, that the concept of liberty was, and even today is, exclusively a Western concept. While Gandhi was agitating the masses for his own political motives, to get so-called independence from English, ironically, with the help of exactly the same English, there were many other Indians who were trying to fight the cultural backwardness of India and superstitiousness and irrationality of India. Now remember, these were the days when widows were burned on the funeral pyre of their husbands. Who in his right mind at that time would be fighting the English rather than use their help to fight the cultural problems of the country? Now, I travel extensively. I have been to over 70 countries and I have lived in 6 or 7 countries. What I do know is that if that journalist asked me the same question, I would have responded very differently. I would have said that the word Western was superfluous. Let me explain. With a slight exception of East Asia, everywhere I go outside the West, societies exist based on superstitions, irrationalities, and tribalism. The concept of reason is almost exclusively, even today, a Western concept. And for me, reason and civilization are synonymous. And despite the massive increase in communication over the last 30 years, given the internet, cheap travel, the concept of reason, I encounter this again and again, continues to be almost exclusively a Western concept. In my view, it is the concept of reason that distinguished humanity from animals. This seminar celebrates the concept of reason, argumentation, and discussion. This seminar celebrates the core values of the Western civilization. Over the next 1.5 days, you will hear from 13 speakers. Each of these speakers has a reputation for excellence in what they do. They are beautiful minds. This is a philosophical seminar. I don't think a change in our society and human race can happen through politics or activism. I hope the next 1.5 days are fruitful for all of us. Our first speaker is Dr. Warren Farrell. Dr. Farrell has been published in over 50 countries in 17 languages. This includes 2 award-winning books, international bestsellers, why men are the way they are, and the myth of the male power. Dr. Farrell's The Myth of Male Power challenges the feminist analysis of power and documents how it has damaged universities, the government, relationships, and children. In Why Men Earn More, another of his books, Dr. Farrell says that the interpretation of the pay gap as based on discrimination is both inaccurate and undermines women. Dr. Farrell has taught at universities in 5 disciplines and appeared on more than 1,000 TV and radio shows. He has been featured repeatedly in Forbes, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and other international publications. Dr. Farrell will be speaking on how the boy crisis expands government and undermines morality. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Warren Farrell.
Before I start, I just want to say that people who speak get a lot of attention, but the people who really deserve the applause and the appreciation of the audience are Jayant and Rajni, especially Jayant, who has put months and months of hard work planning behind the scenes details to make this happen for us. And so let's just stand up and give a hand to So many people haven't even heard of a boy crisis, and the people that have just think maybe there's a problem with more women doing better in education and boys falling a little bit behind in that area. But that's like the very tip of the iceberg. So let me just take a little bit of a poll in here. I'll ask you to stand up if you have a son, a grandson, or a nephew. A son, a grandson, or nephew. If you do, stand up, please. I'll ask you to remain standing if one or more of them has a problem with ADHD, with addiction to video games, tends to not be as motivated as you remember yourself being, or has problems with grades beyond his or her intelligence insofar as you can determine that.
Can you throw in autism?
Autism is a part of the, ADHD is part of the autism spectrum, yes. For sure. So remain standing if one or more of them has challenges in those areas. Okay, so we're seeing that about 70% of the people in this room who have a son, grandson, or a nephew, one of them in your family is having challenges with ADHD, with motivation, with grades. So just to get a sense that the boy crisis is everywhere in every developed country in the world, and I'll explain why. Thank you. I'm going to do this. I'm going to start with an executive overview, just to give you a sense of the bigger picture, and then I'm going to go into why we're blind to the boy crisis in that sense, in that overview. The evidence for it, just the tip of the iceberg of the evidence, some of the most important causes, and one or two of the most important solutions, and then I'm going to go in depth for that, and then you're going to take me into greater depth by our questions and answers with each other. I do questions and answers differently just to prepare yourself for that. When we get to the questions and answer stage, I'll be asking you to ask me a question, say your name, ask me a question, but before I answer the question, since so many of us in this room have experiences as parents that go way beyond any one person's experience, I'm going to ask one or two other people to contribute your thoughts, ideas, or feelings to answer that question, and then I'll give my perspective, and then we'll move on to another question. So I'd like to get everybody involved in the process. In the afternoon time, when I'm doing the myth of male power, I'll have every single one of you involved in some audience participation things in relation to your family. So here's the, I'm going to ask you to sort of get ready for both the tip of the iceberg now. If there's a boy crisis, then almost logically there's going to be a man crisis. And if that's so, why are we just beginning to hear about male problems only through the lens of the boy crisis? How many of you have heard, at least, of some type of boy problems? Raise your hand. How many of you have heard of a man crisis? Oh, we're actually a much higher percentage of this room than normal. That would make sense. So why? Let me deal with men in relation to women first. When adult men complain, women hear whining. Women fall in love with alpha men, not whining men. So, for example, if a man tells a woman, "I have a fear of sexual rejection," the woman may have a bit of empathy, but what she'll quickly move to is, "I remember when a guy, I said no to a guy, and a guy tried to get me drunk, he ignored my nose, he was completely insensitive. So you're expressing your fears of sexual rejection triggers for her own fears." That's what happens to a woman very frequently when an adult man expresses his feelings or fears. But if she should hear her son say, "Mom, I'm afraid to call Krista. Krista's too good for me." What happens to you as a mom? You immediately say, "Sweetie, nobody's too good for you." And you move into protector mode. So when a young boy expresses his feelings, especially a son to a mother doesn't become fearful of hearing them, or it doesn't trigger a defensive response, it triggers a protector response. Let's deal with men. If a man complains to a man, a man gives another man about a max of a 3-minute window of opportunity to complain. That's a max. After which respect tends to decline, promotions are lost, and friendships are avoided. So men basically learn it's not that good to express feelings of vulnerability to women, and it's not that good to express feelings of vulnerability to men. For both sexes, hearing an adult man complain is like hearing nails on a chalkboard. So in contrast, if a woman is complaining, that is seen as an opportunity for a man to rescue her, to solve her problem, to feel respected, to have a chance to be rewarded with sex, and more important, with her love. A totally different experience of a man complaining to a woman complaining. If a man complaining works against him, how then can a man be heard? A man can only be heard through the lens of boys. When a woman hears a man complain, it violates her instinct to be protected, but when her son complains, it triggers her instinct to protect. We're willing to protect boys until we protect them to become men. So just go over that again. We're willing to protect boys only until we move into expecting them to become men. So the only way adult men's issues can be heard by either sex is through the experience of boys. Our blindness to the challenges of males surround us. When a police officer shoots a black man, we rightly protest Black Lives Matter. But the other half of black man is man. No man is shot because the man is shot because he's black, and also because he's a man. The police don't go around shooting very many black girls or black women. Our blindness is the symptom. So let's go deeper for a moment. Why are we blind to the man in black man or the boy in black boy? Because every society that survived did so by training its boys to consider themselves heroes if they were willing to sacrifice themselves so that others could live. We are blind to the boy crisis because our survival has been dependent on our son's willingness to die. If our survival has been dependent on our son's willingness to die, being sensitive to male death is in competition with our survival instinct. We cannot become too psychologically attached to something or someone we know we might lose. Becoming conscious of this is, I believe, our next evolutionary shift. So, how bad is the boy crisis? Let's take a look. For the first time in US history, by the way, the boy crisis, we'll see in a little while, exists in every developed country around the world. I'll work more on why developed countries. For the first time in US history, though, our sons will have less education than our dads. In Canada, it's about equal. Sons will have about an equal amount of education to their dads. Get a little sense of that by looking at the red bars at the bottom about having less education than their dads. The UN finds that boys have fallen behind girls in every one of the largest 70 developed countries. Here's a selection of those developed countries. The blue versus the pink lines indicate the degree to which the boys versus the girls are low achievers. Note the United States is worse than average, Canada is slightly better than average. So why developed countries? Developed countries can afford the luxury of what? Divorce. Once there's the luxury to divorce, you have cause number one, dad-deprived boys. With less father involvement, children of both sexes do worse in more than 30 different areas. They're less likely to have empathy, they're less likely to be assertive, they're less likely to feel motivated. But they are much more likely to be depressed, get involved in drinking, drugs, school shootings, and incarceration. Prisons are basically centers of dad-deprived boys. In California, where I live, we've built 20 new prisons and 1 new university since 1980. In the US as a whole, this gives you a sense of that we've had a 700% increase in the prison population. The prison population is 93% male. And that's just since 1972. And so here's the most frequent pattern as to why that's the case. Danger tends to begin when more conflict is heard and less data is seen. So this is the visual imagery that I created of less dad being seen. All right, we took care of you. We'll move on. As dad leaves, depression tends to arrive. We take the case of Anthony Sims in Oakland just a few months ago. Here is Anthony Sims' last Facebook post. It's, "I wish I had a father." Anthony Sims soon became the Oakland killer. Boys who hurt us. There's been an average of 1 school shooting per week in the United States since Sandy Hook. We tend to blame school shootings on family values, on guns, on violence in the media, and all of those I think are important. But our daughters do live in the same houses, with the same family values, with the same guns, with the same violence in the media. Yet our daughters are not doing the school shootings. Our sons are. So here are shootings, just to give you a sense of this, in 2 years' worth of school shooting locations. I think the blinds are closing so that nobody can see the school shootings. Here we go. put so much effort into creating these videos, and so I didn't want you to lose the benefit of them. School shootings. You keep wanting to shoot, don't you? School shootings are mostly white boys' method of acting out their hopelessness and also committing what? Every boy who does a school shooting is also basically committing suicide. He's either doing it directly or he's doing it for all practical purposes indirectly. Suicide is a reflection, in my opinion, of how we fail boys on their journey to manhood. Here is the data. At age 9, boys and girls commit suicide about equally. Between 10 and 14, boys commit suicide about twice the rate of girls. 15 and 19, 4 times the rate. Between ages 20 and 24, it is almost 6 times the rate of girls. You get a sense that these are the years when boys learn how to be what? How to be men. And that's the result of the boys who feel that they haven't made it in its worst dimension. So cause number 1 is dad-deprived boys. And then these boys, deprived of dads at home, are deprived of what in school? They're deprived of male teachers in school. So not only are they deprived of male teachers, this feminization of education, which is, I think, cause 2, is despite the fact that study after study is showing that boys tend to do better with male teachers. That's not a complete one way or the other, but that's a tendency. Here's one reason which the UN just found applies worldwide. This is the unconscious bias against boys. Boys are 1/3 more likely to be graded higher on a reading test when the teacher does not know that the person who took the test is a boy. Just read and absorb that again. Boys are 1/3 more likely to be graded higher on a reading test when the teacher doesn't know that the person who took the test is a boy. It tells you a huge amount. Boys, I believe, unconsciously absorb this bias as girls would absorb this bias when that bias was more against girls 40, 50 years ago. And the result is that, or that's one reason for that result. Let's look at cause 3, purpose void. Until recently, boys' sense of purpose was to either raise money or to be a worrier. Today, only about 9% of boys become worriers, and sole breadwinners, being a sole breadwinner, no longer defines masculinity. When divorces altered male-female roles, the women's movement prepared for this. They prepared for this by expanding women's potential sense of purpose with 3 options. Girls' 3 options for a sense of purpose was to either work full-time, or children full-time, or some combination of both. Boys, of course, have 3 options too. We never have fewer options than women, of course. Option 1 is to work full-time. Option 2 is to work full-time. And option 3 is to work full-time. We prepared women for the STEM professions, science, technology, engineering, and math, but no one prepared our sons for the caring professions. So a solution to the purpose void is preparing boys for the caring professions, preparing boys to be psychologically prepared to be full-time dads, or elementary school teachers, or social workers, or health workers. The health industry is predicted to expand far more than manufacturing, far more than industries that boys have tended to get into when they weren't academically at the top of their game. One possibility is creating a White House Council on Boys and Men to address the 10 causes of the boy crisis, to bring it to the conscious level, therefore being able to reduce government in a different way, which I'll get into in a moment. Let me deal with this. One of the questions I get a lot is, Warren, that caring profession stuff, that's a really sweet, nice idea. But I don't really know any real man that would really want to take off full-time and be full-time involved with his children. That just doesn't really ring true for me. And I began to have a bit of a understanding of this as long ago as 1975, when I was writing for Ms. Magazine, the feminist magazine, and and one of the other writers was at a party with me for a celebration of the magazine's anniversary, and we were on a boat, and this guy comes up and he says, are you that Warren, I think it's Farrell? And I go, yes. And he goes, I started a few hundred men's groups, and one of the groups I would start the groups, stay with them for a week or two, and then go on and do my own thing and start new groups and speak other places. And so he said, I started a group that you joined. I joined a group that you started, and it really had a big impact on my life. And I said, yeah, go ahead and tell me more. And he said, well, the men's group said, what is the biggest hole in your heart? And I was thinking that's a stupid question, but as it got around to me, I just sort of blurted out that the biggest hole in my heart was having a boy and leaving him and being so focused on my career, I really never got to know who he was. And my wife felt neglected, and eventually we got a divorce. And I guess that, Warren, the reason that's striking me is in such a powerful way right now, I said to the group, was because my wife has just told me she's pregnant. My new wife has just told me she's pregnant, and that we've just found out that it's going to be a boy, and I'm fearful that I'm going to do the same thing all over again. And so the guys in my group said, do you have to do the same thing all over again? And he said, I don't think my wife would be very good about my just taking off from work. And they said, back up. What is it that you would most like to do if you could do anything you wanted to? You have enough money, you can make any choice that you want to do what you want to do. And he said, I don't think so. All the things I'm doing to make money are tying me into contracts and many other things. And so they said, have you checked this even out with your wife? No. Go home and check it with your wife. We'll bring it up next week. So he said, I did that. Came back, my wife said, fine, John, if that's what you want to do, you do it. And so he came back to the group and he said, she said, do what you want to do. So the group says, what do you want to do? And the group, jokingly, I said, if I really had my druthers, I'd just take off for 5 years and raise my son until he got into kindergarten or first grade and be fully involved raising my son full time. And so the group goes, do it. And he goes, you guys are so unrealistic. There's so many things I have as responsibilities. And they said, undo them. And so it took me a year to undo my responsibilities. But he said, I've done that, and I'm now been fully involved with my son full time. And he goes, I said, well, so how is that working? Your son is about 2 now? And he goes, yeah. And he said, Warren, it's by far the best decision I have ever made in my life. I said, why? He said, I talked a lot about love, but until every day I had to figure out what my son wanted, whether it was more or less of this bottle formula or more or less of my wife's milk, whether how to put the jacket on, everything. Is he too upset? Does he need a bath? Does he need this? Does he need that? Am I smelling something? Every moment I was focused on him. I suddenly discovered that love was not about me or what I said. Love was about being able to love. And he said, for the first time in my life, I realized this. And we were sitting there, and I was just basically holding his hand as he was just crying with the feelings that he was having. And as I looked at him, somebody came up to the table and said, I had just come back from my first book tour, and somebody came up and said, can I have your autograph? And I reached up to give an autograph, and the guy looks really awkward and says, I see him being stiff, and I go, what's happening here? And he goes, oh, I definitely would like your autograph too, but I was really wanting his autograph. And so totally embarrassed. The other guy signs his autograph, and I'm saying, I guess I explained to him I have not had a TV for about 15 years, and I rarely watch it, but I guess you're famous? And he goes, no, let's just continue our conversation. I said, no, seriously, what is your last name? I guess I picked up that your first name is John. And he goes, Lennon. And I, oh, you're John Lennon. I go, aren't you a member of a singing group? And he goes, yes. And I said, what's the name of the group? He goes, the Beatles. And suddenly I realized I knew what the Beatles were. And so, dead with embarrassment, I was, but then I began to get nervous in talking with him. And so I think what I saw though in that experience was that here is a real man. Here's a man who was making, probably the equivalent of billions of dollars. Here's a man that had in some ways the most enviable job of anyone in the world, the most enviable career of anybody in the world. And yet he said his best decision that he'd ever made in his life was not hooking up with the Beatles, was not any of the promotions, none of the career opportunities, but raising his son for 5 years, disconnecting from everything he had felt connected to. I think what John Lennon discovered, as I got it, was another John Lennon. The John Lennon who earned love by being not a human doing, not that John Lennon, but the John Lennon who discovered that he could be love. I think now we have an opportunity to be pioneers in this evolutionary shift, to find the love that's been repressed in men, and to be the love that we want our sons to be. And that's obviously John with Sean. So I'm going to take you into the in-depth part. So let me just, since we're going to do the home stretch here, let's just all stand up and stretch before we get into it. Give yourself a little stretch. Take the legs up and down. This is what happens when you hire somebody from California. Okay, I'll ask you to sit back down again. Okay, so let's go deeper into the evidence. We're not going to have a chance to do each of these, but I'll give you some sense of the overview of the boy crisis. There's both the evidence and the cause and solutions. There are basically in the evidence area, there's evidence in the area of education, the drop in boys' IQs, the careers and jobs, physical health, mental health, and all of this, as I said, is worldwide. There are basically 9 causes of the boy crisis that I've identified. One is the purpose void that I've given you a little bit of a clue about. The second, I'll get into in a minute, is video game addiction. Third is dad-deprived boys, as we've gotten a little bit into. Fourth is misandry, what I call the new sexism. And then fifth is masculinity as low health intelligence. Causes 6 through 9, ADHD. Gentleman here described autism as part of the autism spectrum. The perfect storm of sex, women, and porn. The feminization. I won't get into that. I have time to get into that, but if you have any interest in asking me questions about that, I'll be happy to elaborate on that in the question and answer time. The feminization of education and the feminization of careers. So on looking at the evidence, is there really a boy crisis? How many of you have seen the book The End of Men, or the Atlantic article called The End of Men? You probably, some of you are familiar with that. That became a huge, a big bestseller, and it was one of the most popular articles of its time a few years ago. But if our sons see the end of men as their future, that doesn't give them a lot of inspiration for life's journey. In fact, while we do see tens of thousands of our sons doing exceptionally well, but we see millions of our sons worldwide doing extraordinarily poorly. Worse on average than we've ever seen in history. As young men, our sons are much more likely than they've ever been to be unemployed, underemployed, unable to not only commit to a partner, but unable to or undesirous of committing to parenting, They're often financially supported by their parents. There are now more boys going back to live with parents than there are girls going back to live with parents after college. There being more and more boys supported by government, but most frequently the way the boys are supported by government is being supported by a prison, committing suicide at 5 times the rate of their sisters. In brief, parents and teachers are seeing in our sons a lack of motivation, or what's sometimes called a failure to launch, which is basically little inspiration for life's journey. The consequences are, let's put it this way. On the one hand, our inventors and our CEOs are more than 90% likely to be which gender? Male. On the other hand, our prisoners and our serial killers are more than 90% likely to be which gender? Male. Boys who have a sense of purpose become one of our society's most constructive forces. Boys who have no sense of purpose, or what I call a purpose void, become one of society's most destructive forces. Let's get into the area of how this happens with education. Recent studies show that IQ, the difference in education between our sons and our daughters, we can see that the male graph goes way down and the female graph goes way up, completely reversing from 1966 to the projection of 2019. Boys' IQs have dropped about 15 points since the 1980s. This is despite the fact that the normal incline of IQ is to increase significantly with each generation, about 10 points with each generation. Despite that, boys have gone down 15 points since the 1980s. Boys who are nearly 12 years old today are doing as well as the 8 to 9-year-old boys in the 70s. Since boys are disposable if they don't perform, the following poster was so popular that it became a book, a t-shirt, and an entire industry. Boys are stupid, throw rocks at them. When boys don't perform, they are consciously or unconsciously disposable. Our son's physical health. Let's take a look at that. In 1920, American boys and men lived just 1 year less than women. Today, American boys and men live 5 fewer years. In just 90 years, the male-female life expectancy gap has grown 400%. Basically, males' deaths in war and females' deaths in childbirth have been reduced by about an equal amount. Boys today have sperm counts less than half of what their grandfathers had at that age. That's just the tip of the iceberg of the evidence. Let's look at an in-depth look at cause number 2, another cause, the purpose void. Being a hero, if you think about what a hero, what the definition of a hero is, it's basically somebody who dies or risks dying so somebody else would live. When we call a boy a hero, it's a social bribe to risk death and have him in his mind's eye associate death, his willingness to die so others will live, as his sense of purpose. That sales pitch is a social bribe to get him to die, to put respect for himself and honor for himself over his life. There's nothing more central to the psychology of masculinity than the psychology of male disposability. You cannot understand the underlying causes of why the boy crisis is if you don't start with that stepping block. The good news is that today, fewer men need to be disposable in war, and being a sole breadwinner no longer defines masculinity. The bad news is that disposability as purpose is being replaced by what? No purpose. And what happens with boys without purpose? They become the world's most destructive forces. The bad news is that men come back from war When boys and men risk disposability today, they come back for more as half men. And we don't take care of them, especially in the United States, we don't take care of them. And as a result of that, more US military in the United States are killed in 1 year than were killed in the war in Iraq and Afghanistan in all years combined. Every 65 minutes in the United States, a veteran commits suicide. Cause number 2, in-depth video game addiction. First of all, there's a lot to like about video games, and I want to be really clear about that. A number of video games are ways, done well, are ways of uniting the family. They are ways of creating friendships, different ways of creating friendships than we knew when we grew up, if you're older. Others are excellent for preparing boys for careers, for time in the military, for robotics. Some are proven to really develop and increase boys or girls' spatial skills, their problem-solving skills, their reflexes, their focus, the hand-eye motor coordination, and action games, even games of violence, are very likely to help decision-making. The speed of thinking increases, the brain functions more quickly, and virtually all video games reduce stress. So that's the good news about video games. The bad news about video games is that while video game addiction occasionally happens to our daughters, it much more frequently happens to who? Our sons, our boys, yes. And here's why. Teenage boys use video games an average of 13 hours per week. Teenage girls use them about 5 hours per week. 5 hours a week tends to be healthy. 13 hours a week tends to border on addiction. This, by the way, this statistic doesn't include a greater likelihood on the part of boys of viewing pornography, obviously, watching sports, and looking at mobile devices. The brain images of boys playing video games find the games can affect the brain in a way that is similar to cocaine. Their impact is also similar to the ADHD drugs Ritalin, Adderall, and Concerta, which also affect the brain a lot like cocaine. Here's what we learned from the brain images studies about how video games drain the brain. Playing video games motivates a boy's brain, or a girl's brain if she does it too much, brain to win at the game, but it doesn't motivate him to win at life. So for example, he can be a really major player and winner at NFL Madden football as a video game, but not ever even have an interest in throwing a football, catching a football, or learning any football strategy that he himself will use in real life. I'll explain why. Here's a brain image. Notice that the nucleus accumbens part of the brain, when you play video games, this engorges the nucleus accumbens part of the brain with blood. This makes your son, and sometimes of course your daughter, motivated to win at the game, but it doesn't motivate him to win in life. And that's because it shuts off the blood flow to the part of the brain, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain that is responsible for translating motivation into goals in the real world. So here's when you play the actual football or any game in the real world with real people outside physically, this part of your brain tends to translate the ways of transforming that game into real life. But this part of the brain is what does it just to win the game. And so the video games tend to make boys a winner in the virtual world and not in the real world. And his real life motivation tends to be drained. By age 21, boys average 14,000 hours of gaming. It takes only a third of that time to get a bachelor's degree. Just to give you a sense of perspective, a bachelor's degree takes about 4,800 hours, including homework. The solution is not to eliminate video games. The solution is VGIM, or video games in moderation. Video games are basically like red wine. For people without addictive tendencies, a little can be good for you. So the question then becomes well, that's very nice, Warren. The solution is video games in moderation, but how do we get from video game addiction to video game moderation? The best path to video game in moderation is parental boundary enforcement. And that tends to be the parent that both sexes tend to set boundaries about equally. But dads tend to be more likely to enforce the boundaries that are set. And so the involvement of dads tends to be, the lack of involvement of dads tends to be cause number 3, related to boundary enforcement, which is related to eliminating video game addiction. And I'll put that connection together in a second. For the first time in US history, more than 50% of children born to mothers under 30 were born outside of marriage, usually meaning little or no father involvement. The data is almost as bad as that in Canada. The percent of non-marital births to all women, you can see how it used to be 34%, it is now 53% to, this is to all women, this is women under 30, this red line, this blue line is all women. But women under 30, 53% who have children have them without being married. Now, I have no big thing about the need to marry, but I do have a big thing about when I did the research for a book I wrote called Father and Child Reunion. I saw over and over again that when children are brought up without an equal amount of both parents, there is usually significant problems, but especially significant problems for boys. It's, the problems, by the way, are for both sexes, but they're even more accentuated for boys. Today, 1 out of every 3 children in America lives in father-absent homes. One of the things that happens that's different for boys versus girls is that boys tend to look to their dads, obviously, as a role model, and desire to be a dad begins with a son who sees in his own dad who he can become. And if he sees a dad divorced, living in a small apartment, paying child support, but not being able to see his son, the problem is not only the damage it does to the son directly, but his vision as to what his chances of what he will be when and if he gets married, he begins to have an unconscious articulation of that. But he can't talk to his dad about that because that forces his dad to sort of say things that he thinks maybe he's too young to hear. Can't talk to his mom about that because that gets them into arguments. So he's caught between a rock and a hard place. He starts keeping it inside of himself. The psychologist finally gets it out of him, but the psychologist is afraid to be too biased in favor of any given way of looking at things. And so the boy oftentimes turns to drugs, video games, or withdraws on some level. We combine that with an overall image of dads that I'm going to show you an image which is pretty amazing in a minute, but how that image survived is what is really more amazing. This is the Dallas area rapid transit buses. This image was on their bus. One day, when I grow up, I will beat my wife. One day, my husband will kill me. Note the boy is not saying, I may beat my wife, but the word will. I will beat my wife. So here's the real issue. Why does the billboard with the boy feature a white boy? If a DART bus had a poster of a black boy saying, I will beat my wife, the racism would have been so apparent that the billboard never would have gotten through the first level of the city government to be able to be posted. But we're so blind to the sexism that few people even know that there's a word for sexism against men called misandry. We're blind enough to the misandry that Dallas city employees approved of the billboards, another group distributed it, another group hung them, drivers drove with them on the buses, tens of thousands of citizens of Dallas rode on the buses with them. There was virtually no protest because we're so blind to the sexism in that. In effect, the spreading of negative images about your son, in this particular case, is taxpayer-supported misandry that we're all blind to. And this boy is a potential dad. What's missing when dad's missing? First, the more dad is involved, that is, the more a dad is what I call the more a family is what I call dad rich, the better a child does in more than 30 areas of measurement. Just a few examples of these is the more dad's time, the more dad is involved, the less drugs are likely to happen. The most important single factor by far in preventing drug use is a close relationship with dad. So in this group, just think for a second. Think of the billions of dollars we spent preventing drug use by the government. But the most important single preventer of drug use is not the government, but what?
Dad.
Dads. Dad's time versus money. In a non-intact family, time with dad helps a child's well-being more than money for dad. But the child enforcement laws, at least in the United States, around collecting money from dads is more than 500 times as great as the laws helping women, enforcing women to get and have the father involved with the dad. Boys who live with their fathers after divorce tend to be warmer, they have a higher degree of self-esteem, they tend to be more mature and more independent than boys who do not. Worldwide, this is the most amazing, in my opinion, one of the most amazing and important PowerPoint points. Worldwide, the amount of time a father spends with his child is one of the strongest predictors of empathy in adulthood. This is not because men are more empathetic than women. If I were to share my own bias, I think on average, women are more empathetic than men. But more empathy toward the child does not create the child's ability to be empathetic. Forcing the child to think about somebody else other than himself or herself is what forces the child to begin to develop its sense of empathy. So to not only say, mom and dad are paying attention to my feelings, but also I need to pay attention to mom and dad's feelings as well. That's the preparation for empathy. That begins to be what triggers it. Any one of these items, I think, has enormous implications. The drugs item, the time being important, and so on. But the reason I'm so powerfully engaged with the word empathy is because I've never heard someone say, Warren, I do a lot of couples communication skill workshops. I've never heard somebody say to me, Warren, I want a divorce. My partner really understands me. That one word, millions and billions of women get diamond rings, they get jewelry from their husbands, but they don't feel they get understanding. Millions of prostitutes will tell us, the man that comes to me will often say, I don't feel my wife understands me more than any other single sentence that comes out of his mouth. The only person in a marriage who feels really understood is no one. And that's what really needs to change if we really want marriages to stay together and our children to have both parents. All of this, of course, is as frustrating for our daughters as our sons. Women want mature, motivated men. Women are completely uninterested in marrying men who may be reading books like Why Men Are the Way They Are on the unemployment line. Relationship books come second, but once a man is successful, then the woman is interested in his relationship skills. Not the other way around. When the family is weak, the government becomes strong. The government becomes a substitute dad. When the government is a substitute dad, the family becomes weaker again, and the cycle goes in that direction.
In 1965, Secretary of Labor's Moynihan's report discovered that the deterioration of the inner-city African-American community was not due to race or poverty, but to the absence of dads. At that point, father absence was 25% for that community. Now it's 33% for the nation as a whole. Yet divorces and family courts that marginalize dads, plus moms having children without being married, are exacerbating the fatherlessness that's killing the family tree. Our sons, without their biological role model, are dropping out of schools, facing unemployment and imprisonment, becoming rudderless, angry, and suicidal, plus a host of other issues as seen on the fatherless tree. In Father and Child Reunion, Dr. Warren Farrell concluded that the absence of dad creates the presence of government, and that government is a failure as a substitute dad. We have formed a coalition to create a White House Council on Boys and Men to focus the efforts of government on getting more involvement by more dads so we can reduce the government as substitute dad. We need your involvement.
There was a little pitch that we did for that effort that did a relationship that we were talking about a minute ago. So in the past, boys fulfilled their sense of purpose and mission by a career that lasted a lifetime. So I'm looking at the possibility of fathering being sold to boys as a new sense of purpose instead of dying being sold to boys as a sense of purpose. I think it's a little bit easier sell. At least John Lennon found it to be. In the future, careers, I think, will rarely last a lifetime. It is preparing your son to be a dad that will give him a sense of purpose for a lifetime. Nothing can reduce the size of government more effectively than father involvement. So it's important then to know exactly why. What is involved with father involvement? How does it differentiate from mother involvement that makes it so important not to be the only involvement with the child, but to be in about equal checks and balances with mother involvement? The key 3 words there are what? Checks and balances. Mothers and fathers work best when they have a natural tension with each other, just like government and private industry work best when they have a natural tension with each other. So how do dad's contributions tend to work? Roughhousing, coaching, and play, those are 3 dad traits. And those 3 dad traits tend to create a bond with the child. That bond makes the child feel that the dad is involved in it as an ally in his team. The child then becomes receptive to criticism from the dad because the child perceives the dad as helping him or her become a winner against an adversary. So in schools that really train boys and girls well, they give a huge amount of physical activity at the beginning. They have the children in the school involved with coaches, but the key difference is that the coaches that help them at the beginning of the day stay in contact with them throughout the whole day, so if they run into an algebra problem they can't solve, or they just are giving up on reading because it's, quote, too boring or whatever, that the coach stays with them and takes the same skills of, okay, you overcame this when you were in the physical activity, you can overcome this algebra problem, you can overcome this reading problem, you can overcome your adversary. But the child and the parent have to have a bond first. That bond comes from the physical activity very frequently and through coaching, through playing, through roughhousing together. No, the reason mothers don't understand that is because dads haven't done their homework about why they're useful. And women can't hear what men don't say. And so people are ignorant as to that type of dynamic. Without the bond of coaching or roughhousing, the teacher or parent who criticizes tends to feel to the child like she or he, the parent, is an adversary. With the bond, the child learns to take criticism as if they're a coach. When I criticize a little boy, oftentimes he'll just think, if I get this down, I'll be able to be a better soccer player. So I've got to get this down really in the right way. If I do that with a girl who doesn't have aspirations to be a soccer player, she often handles the criticism as criticism. But if she sees that she can prepare herself to be something effective in the world and soccer will help her there, then she sees the criticism as coaching. Boundary enforcement, I mentioned, is one of the crucial differences between moms and dads. So let me give an example of that. This is particularly true in a divorce situation. In a divorce situation, moms will tend to feel guilty about the fact that they're divorced and the child is sort of feeling sort of vulnerable. And so, but mom and dad will still have the exact same boundary setting. The mom and dad will say something like, you can't have your ice cream, sweetie, until you finish your peas. And so the child will tend to do the boundary testing, of course. And the child will do something like have a few peas and then say to mom, Mommy, I had a few peas, can I have my ice cream now? And mom will start thinking to herself, gee, we've just been through a divorce, the child's being through a hard time, I've come back from working really hard, these are my few precious moments with my child, am I going to have a big argument now over a few peas? I don't think so. That's completely insensitive. Okay, sweetie, you had at least, I'll tell you what, take 2 more peas, then you can have your ice cream. So the child is learning that with my mom, if I don't pay attention to exactly what she says, but I think about how can I negotiate a better deal. Is the better deal by having my mom feel empathetic to me? Is my mom feeling sad about something that she did? Did she not come home too late? What can I take advantage of to get that ice cream sooner? And so the studies of children with moms find that the moms feel very overwhelmed. They feel often they're in coercive relationships with their son or their daughter because the child is learning, I don't need to pay attention to what I'm asked to do. I need to pay attention to what I can do to manipulate a better deal. Now, dad gives the same boundary setting. The child, it's divorce, and the dad says, you can't have your ice cream until you finish your peas. The child tries to manipulate a better deal. The dad goes, excuse me, you know the deal. You can not have the peas, but then you would have the ice cream. You know the deal. You know that I know the deal, and you know that I know that you know the deal. So, just make your choice. You are so mean, Daddy. Mommy lets me have the peas, sooner. Oh, you have a choice of complaining some more. Then there'll be no ice cream tomorrow night either. Nothing, no argument, no voice raising. Here's your choices. And the boy suddenly learns there's no chance with this dad. So I better complete the project. So children raised by single moms tend to be twice as likely to have ADHD as children raised by single dads, even though children raised by single dads are far more likely to get the developmentally challenged children. How is this? Just take that example as one way of looking at that. The child with the mom learned to focus on not doing what she or he was asked to do. So attention deficit came by not paying attention to what the child was asked to be focused on, finishing those peas. The child with the father had no option but to pay attention to what it had to do in order to get what it wanted to have. The child with the dad learned postponed gratification. What we know about postponed gratification is that postponed gratification is the single greatest predictor, aside from father involvement, in whether a child will become successful as an adult. The problem is,
could you say that again?
yes, the last part? Yes, postponed gratification is the single greatest predictor, aside from father involvement, of what leads to a child being likely to be successful as an adult. We saw this originally in the marshmallow experiment done by Phil Zimbardo back in the 70s at Stanford, where a child was given two marshmallows and told that if she or he, that the adult was going to leave the room. And then when the adult, and that if the child had ate both marshmallows, that would be the only marshmallows it would get. But if the child did not eat both marshmallows, but saved them, then the child would have more treats afterwards. And the children that ate the marshmallows while the adult was out were much more likely to do worse in life than the children that had postponed gratification that could wait to get the bigger picture, the bigger amount of gift at the end. The problem is when the father is a sole breadwinner, here's what happens. there's a father's catch-22. The father's catch-22 is that dads learn to love their family by being away from the love of their family, by being at work. And the qualities that it takes to be successful at work often make him a failure at home. The more successful he is at work, the less successful he tends to be at love. So, for example, good attorneys are excellent at finding fault. But if you're so excellent at finding fault with your wife, that doesn't tend to make a better marriage. But do dads, the next question becomes, but do dads really want to be the new family man? And in a Pew Research Center, which is probably the most respected survey center, half of working dads said, I'd prefer to be home with my children, but we need the income. So one solution is a gender liberation movement. And I look at it this way. In the past, mothers learned to row the family boat only from the right side of raising children. Fathers learned to row it only from the left side of raising money. Today, mothers can row from both sides, but dads have been trained to row only from one. If a mom wants to or needs to row from the left and a dad can only row from the left, then that boat tends to go in circles. The dad loses his job, and then there's if both parents can only row from one side of the boat, that boat goes in circles. In the future, advanced technologies make economic change the only constant we're going to be dealing with, which is going to increase the need for a family boat with flexibility. With our sons eventually able to raise children as comfortable as our daughters are now raising money. And this will lead to less and less government involvement as a substitute dad. So I'd like to see us substituting dad for government rather than the other way around. We don't need a women's liberation movement blaming men, nor a men's liberation movement blaming women. We need a gender liberation movement helping both sexes to make a transition from the rigid roles of the past to more flexible roles for our future. Just as our daughters have learned to get the wind beneath their wings, I think so also our sons can discover that they can be unique selves, that they can express their feelings and become, for the first time in history, men not with superficial power, but with real power. Not the power to be programmed to be human doings, not the power to feel obligated to earn money that someone else spends while we die sooner, the way men currently define power, feeling obligated to earn money that someone else spends while we die sooner, but to be human beings instead. This is our duty to our sons. And it's also our gift to our sons. And it's our gift to our daughters, or at least those of our daughters who would choose to marry boys and men. Thank you. I have some time for questions. I'll ask you, when you ask questions, to actually, we have time for something else. I'm going to ask you to quickly get together with I'm going to ask you to get together in groups of 5, and in that group of 5 to go around and say, what was the most important insight you received from the presentation, and what's the most important question you have from this presentation? So I'll ask you to be in groups of 5, make sure that there's at least one woman in each group. There's about 20% women here. So I'll try to the degree that you can, if you have more than one woman in a group, ask her to help to keep the males from being deprived of a female presence. Is there any table with all males that needs the help of a woman to diversify the thinking? I think we're okay. So just stay in the table that you're with. Go quickly around the table. Before you go around the table, I'm going to ask you to choose one person in the group who has a watch with a second hand or an iPhone with a clock on it. Raise your hand if you're at the table, if you have a watch with a second hand or some type of timing device. Raise your hand if you're now at a table where there is no watch with a second hand? Is there anybody with a table that does not have a watch with a second hand, or the iPhone timing device? Okay, one of the people who has a watch with a second hand or iPhone timing device, you're going to be the group facilitator. But make sure it's a person in the group who has a good sense of boundary enforcement. Okay. Yes, okay. Okay, so I'm now going to ask you to do, before we actually start, so you're not thinking about your answer while other people are talking, I'm going to ask you to just close your eyes for a moment and think to yourself two things. Of the things that I mentioned, what is the most important takeaway that you'd like to make sure that you reinforce, articulate, so you don't forget it? Remembering that the most creative ideas are the ideas that have least context, and therefore they're the most easily forgotten. So it's really important to hold on to a creative idea and to repeat it. Second, what is the most important question you have that came to mind as I was talking? So give yourself about 30 seconds to think of answers to both of those questions. Raise your hand if you need more time. Okay, I'm now going to ask you to choose the person who has the best boundary enforcement capability in the group who has a watch with a second hand, and to ask him or her to be the facilitator. Now, facilitators, I'm going to talk to you. You're going to allow each person 45 seconds to say what is the question that they'd most like to ask, what's the idea that they'd like to most hold on to. At the end of 45 seconds, you're going to ask them to hold and move on to the next person. You'll give them 5 seconds grace to make the transition, so you don't just cut their sentence in half as they're talking. So now I'll ask you, if you're the person who's the boundary enforcer with a watch with a second hand, look around the group. Among the people who are sitting at your table, choose the person who looks the most, start with the person who looks most mentally alert. Okay. Ready, get set, go. Thank you so much. That's very thoughtful. I'll ask you now to look around your table and point to the person who had the best, what you feel would be the best takeaway that you'd like to have that person stand up and share before the group from where you're standing. And then also the most important question that came from your table that you'd like to have articulated before the group. Take about 30 seconds to choose the person who will offer the best takeaway and the most important question you'd like to have answered. Ready? 30 seconds, go. which table would like to start? Right, ready to go? Yes. I'll ask you to say your name, and then one person do the takeaway, one person do the question. And would somebody who's a good note taker take down the questions so I can make sure to get back to those questions at the end? I just want to review the questions first. And who will volunteer to be a good inscriber of notes? Phil? Can you do that? Okay. Okay. This table, want to start? Go ahead. All right.
All right. Hi, everybody. So my name is Phil, and the highlight we chose from our table, it was the remark you made, Warren, about how there's this interesting correlation between the level of father involvement and state expansion. I thought that was a very interesting point, one I'll be pondering for a while. And I'll hand off the mic to Kevin, who will be announcing our question.
Well, my name's Kevin, obviously, now. The question that we had was based around the biological aspects that you brought up, both about IQ drop within the recent generation of men, as well as you quickly mentioned a half sperm drop within the current generation of men versus the previous. But we never heard any fact as to why this might be occurring. And that was something that we thought was kind of left on the table, that we were really curious if there was a rationale behind it.
Yes, excellent. There certainly is, and I'll get, so that'll be one of the things I'd love to get to. Thank you, Kevin. It's a thoughtful question.
The question, the slide that you had, my name is Winston Lambert, and the question I had is when you showed the poster that was in the buses in Dallas, the one that you did discuss is more interesting because I will be killed by my husband, a black girl, and if the other one is racist, that's got to be racist to another degree, and yet you didn't address it, so I was curious.
Yes, absolutely. Very good question.
Yes, I have two grandsons, so I'm very interested in this.
Say your name.
Jane.
Jane.
And when you talk about the psychology or the disposability of males being replaced by no purpose, this is something I need to think on. I have no answers or comments on it, but I think that is maybe the most important thing that you brought up is, and how do we develop that purpose?
Very good. Get as many as I can. Let's move on to the next table.
Hi, my name's Liz. The biggest takeaway from our group was having a dad at home acting as a coach and being able to take that away outside of the home. And so I really had a strong coach relationship with my father, and I never really realized that until you articulated it that way. So thank you for that. And I'm going to pass it on to Vanessa for our question.
My name is Vanessa. Our question at the group was in male-dominated fields, the feminism being pushed into certain careers, if you would go into depth about that, or in ones that are typically male-dominated, if you were thinking there would be a shift in the future.
Yes, very good.
My name is Annam, and I was became most emotionally present when you made the correlation between the lack of dads and when I started to see the correlation in the growth of government as well, like the first thing there. And I felt my mind switch right over into solutions thinking at that time.
Good. Say your name.
Hi, my name is Bill. Question that I thought about was, how long a gap can there be if there's a situation where the kids are deprived from their father by the court and visitation and so on? How long a gap can there be before you can reconnect with effectiveness?
Yes, very good. Very important question. Try to help me make sure I get to that question in particular, but there's every question I'd love to get to. But pass it to this table. Say your name.
My name is Micah, and the comment that we came up with was that the government tends to incentivize single parenthood. with lots of incentives for, you know, if you have kids and your dad's not home, they tend to give you money for this kind of stuff and tend to propagate the problem. So
Yes.
that was a comment. One new question. Looks like I'm up for the question too. So the question is, what kind of solutions to the problem might have you thought of on this and stuff like that? And obviously the solution isn't the government, it's something else must be the solution.
Yes. Thank you, Mike.
So we're a little disorganized. Sorry, my name's Carlos, and we're a little disorganized. So the question was the question of practical solutions, and then you had suggested the point, the insight.
Oh. No, I think we talked about like what practical solutions could you do as a family. You're paying for some tools, but it would be interesting. I'm a young parent now. I have 2 small kids. It would be interesting to know what we can actually do. So we can start sort of a micro revolution. So instead of just relying on government, I think that was your point actually. Right?
Yeah. That's what I love about libertarians. They think and they want to do. And say what's your name?
I'm Stefan.
Stefan. Yeah. Stand up and say your name.
My name is Howard, and I'll give you 2 questions. One was, what are the effects of the same-gendered parents, 2 dads or 2 women? And the other is there a difference when it comes to the father being absent from the household, divorce versus an early death of the father?
Yes. Very good questions. You got those, Phil?
I missed the second question.
The divorce. What's the impact of divorce or early death of the father? Is it, it's not the same as a normal absent father in a divorce situation? I'm assuming is the implication of that. Say it again.
Hi, I'm Matt Buffton. I've got a question, which was the video that you showed seemed to sort of imply that fathers had sort of been absent, and then government had tried to fill that stopgap. And my sort of intuition was that it's the other way around. I was wondering which way you think that causality flows, and we could talk more about that. And our comment came from.
Well, take away.
My name is Calvin, and the insight I took away was the idea for parents or fathers to teach their sons to become fathers, to have that be part of their purpose as one step in the solution.
Yes. Did this group back here get a chance to speak up? One with Raji in it? You thought you'd get away with it by just standing? Right.
Okay, hi, I'm Ilya, and the observation that stuck out here was about the connection between ADD and fatherless houses. The question was, when engaging in dialogue about these issues, if you can give some more tips about how to do it without offending people.
Yes, very good. I'll make sure I get to that one. If you would. Yes. And last table, final bit.
My name is Paul. A couple of us thought it was an interesting observation, the connection between delayed gratification and success, and also the connection between a good stiff back of the, that a father may be the one who can impose or lean the child towards appreciating that a little bit more.
Mary Lou Butcher, and actually a lot of our answers were similar, so I'll just kind of capsulize it by saying that it was more about how can one person make a difference in any given family. So specifically, can a substitute father actually replace the real father?
Yes. Okay, any particular question you'd like me to start with? This is the chance that you have. If you move first, you get the choice. Rajni?
Setting on boundaries versus enforcing boundaries.
Yes. And tell me, what would you like to know about that?
How you differentiate and move in a way that it does not violate the harmony and peace, and now being more of diplomatic and making a rational, making an explanation or elaborating fundamentally the question or giving a right direction, so that the person understands what's is it not. It's not enforcement, or you're setting the boundaries but not enforcing it, that you have to do this is the way.
Yes, good. Very good. Important question, because it's there's a boundary between boundary setting and boundary enforcement, or a gray line between boundary setting and boundary enforcement, and also a gray line between being an authoritative parent versus an authoritarian parent. And so usually the parents that are most effective are ones that sort of allow the child to participate in the decision making. I need to have you finish your piece before you finish your ice cream. It's okay to answer the question, why is that important? I don't need to do that, I don't want to do that, and so why are you saying that, mom or dad? And so it's fine for the child to say that, for you to answer that. But when you answer the question, many people who are really good at answers to questions like that are very compassionate people. Compassionate people are very tuned in to the challenges that their children have, and therefore they tend to be more permissive about not allowing those children to sort of then get away with something, because they understand the psychology of what they're going through. So it's important to sort of hear the child's perspective, explain to you, the child, why you feel that it's important to have the piece finished before the ice cream. And then even if the child doesn't understand or agree, then you take over as a parent and say, I'm sorry, this is something that I need to set the boundary with. And then when there's a manipulation, an attempt to manipulate out of boundaries, which the child will always do, that's natural to a child, to try to get as far as she or he can away with something that she wants to have an immediate gratification. You say, no, I'm sorry, you have to finish this first. On the other hand, if you don't finish it, you don't have to, you don't have to finish the peas, then you don't get the ice cream either. And so the tendency of the more understanding parent is to be looser with the boundary enforcement. The good news about moms is that they tend to let the child know that they understand what they're going through. Good dads let the child know what they understand what the child's going through. And the gift of fathers tends to be sometimes they come on the low end of empathy, but by saying, I'm sorry, you have to do this. And if you don't do this, the incentive it'll be worse. It'll be worse because you won't have if you complain, if you try to get away with it, if you try to manipulate, there'll be no ice cream tomorrow night either. So you see this in roughhousing situations too. So let's say you and I I was father and you were daughter, and we were roughhousing with each other, and you were kicking me in a vulnerable place to win in the roughhousing. And then I said to you, it's fine for you to sort of fake with your eyes, and here's what it's okay for you to do in the roughhousing, but you can't poke me, pull my hair, or kick me. And so then you go ahead and we get really excited again because you try to win, and then you kick me again. And so I can do what mothers often do. Mothers don't do much roughhousing, but when the mothers see the child as doing something wrong, they tend to repeat the original command. And then they repeat it again, and then they repeat it again. But what the child picks up is that as long as the command is just being repeated, I'll keep trying to get away with it. But when I say, okay, there will be no more roughhousing if you do the kicking again, then I say, okay, sweetie, no more roughhousing tonight. And then if you start complaining, no more roughhousing tomorrow night either, if you continue complaining about that. And so that's usually that combination is the best way of boundary enforcement. Now, the one reason that children tend to do best in intact families is because the children get the checks and balances of both mothers and fathers. So, for example, if the child says, I really want to climb the tree, And moms will tend to say, sweetie, in a couple of years you can climb the tree, but right now you're too young for that, you could fall out of the tree. Dads will tend to say, yeah, you can climb the tree, but be careful. And so then maybe even the dad will go out by the tree to make sure the child doesn't fall, but maybe we'll get sidetracked with the cell phone. And so if the child goes ahead to try to climb the tree, the mother sees that the child's about ready to climb the tree. So you can't climb that tree, I told you you couldn't. Well, Daddy said I could. Then mom and dad get into an argument about that. Dad says, you're so overprotected. Mom says, yeah, overprotected, but who takes the child to the hospital in the emergency room? And so the two of them get into an argument about that. So the mother and father are standing there thinking that they are hopelessly at odds with each other. In fact, they are doing exactly what they should be doing, having a checks and balance tension between them about the parenting. Because the outcome is often like, okay, the child can climb the tree, but only so far, not out so far on these branches, not on that branch which looks like it's too fragile, and here, I'll take the cell phone. So the child ends up with the ability to take risks, which increases the synapse development in a child's brains and increases IQ, and at the same time gets safety. And so that checks and balances is so important. Now, if there's a divorce, there's a tendency for the children to be about a 90% likelihood to be with the mothers. And if the mother doesn't want the child involved, let's say the mother's met a new man that she feels will be a better father, and the man lives in Calgary and they live in Vancouver, and so there's a bit of a distance there. So the mother petitions the court and says, I need to move to Calgary. The child will have a better life. The new father earns more. He's more responsible. He's better, and he'll be better with the children. Well, the truth is that so the courts will tend to rule in her favor. Somebody asked the question about different types of dads, biological dads versus substitute dads. I was a stepdad. I was a stepdad for two daughters, and so when I started the research on my book, I really wanted stepfathers to be an equal, if not better, alternative to the biological father that I was replacing. That my wife thought that I would be a better dad than he was, even though actually he was a pretty good dad. But the research did not support that a stepfather is more important to the children than a biological dad, even if the stepfather has better parenting skills. And so let's take that a little bit further, like as Mary Lou was asking about that. What's the reason for that? One of the reasons appears to be that whenever you get to reasons, everything is debatable. But one of the reasons appears to be when the child looks in the mirror, say, and begins to hear that, say, the father tends to be irresponsible, tends to be a bit of a liar, tends to exaggerate, tends to do things that are negative. And that child is growing up and looks in the mirror and begins to see that its eyes are like the dad's eyes. Its nose and its body language, its expressions are too like the dad's expressions. So if the child is hearing negative things about the father, the child experiences it as being negative things about himself or herself. And so the child has so much more of a... So you see this with adopted children. Adoptive parents tend to be totally devoted. They're parents by choice beyond parents by choice just coming from intercourse. And so they go through a long process. They're loving parents, but what happens somewhere during the child's developmental process? What is the child looking for? Isn't looking for his biological parents. And I saw that, you see this even in biology. I had a friend come over from New Zealand who was a rancher. He said, Lauren, I just saw the sweetest thing this morning, or the morning before I left. He said, the mother and father of the ducklings in our farm was killed, and the chicken took over the parenting of the kid ducklings. And it was just going absolutely beautifully. I've just never been so touched. I took a lot of pictures of it, showed me the pictures. He said, but one day, the ducklings were old enough to sort of wobble out of the barn, and they went down the hill, and we had a lake at the bottom of the hill, and the ducklings suddenly jumped into the lake, and the chicken is going, wah, 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 you can't jump in a lake and you can't swim. And my daughter, one of my stepdaughters, was there listening to this fellow speaking and said, Oh my God, that's the story of my life. I feel like a duck brought up by a chicken. And as loving as my mom was, I mean my wife, the daughter's mom was, we search for what is biologically within us, even beyond what we know. Which does not mean, back to Mary Lou's question, that there cannot be good and effective parenting substitutes. Some of those, for example, are studies that have been done recently of Cub Scouts, show that almost all the things we would value, integrity, sort of perseverance, motivation, skill sets, those are all things that by joining the Cub Scouts for a year or two or longer, the children are able to pick up very much more effective skill sets and motivations. Substitutes as parents are good. Good role models are good, but I have to say the research shows that having the biological mom and the biological dad present are even more important. So if there's a divorce, there's 4 things that need to happen in order for the child to have a good chance of doing well. Number 1 is about an equal amount of time with mom and dad. Number 2 is the father and mother being close enough to each other physically so that the child does not have to give up the friends' birthdays, activities such as soccer, in order to be able to go to the other parent's house, because that builds resentment. Number 3, the child must overhear no bad-mouthing father to mother or mother to father. And number 4, the parents who do couples communication consistently, not just when there's an emergency, but consistently. When couples do couples communication only when there's an emergency, they tend to do the communication when there's a fight or a battle with their parent, the other parent, and therefore they're seeing and dealing with the parent in enemy mode. It is when there isn't an emergency that the parents have a chance to, and the couple's communication counselor has a chance to really help each parent build empathy for the other parent and an understanding in a less defensive mode and presence. And so those are the 4 things that if you want to raise children in divorce and have them turn out to be about as effective, just slightly less than equally effective than to an intact family, those 4 things must be held with. So that's a multi-level answer to that question, but I hope that addressed some of those issues.
I was not just thinking that the biological father...
One second, let me give you the...
It wasn't just in the case where the biological father still exists. I was talking about disappeared off the planet. Can a woman, an institution, a foster parent, a step-parent, a friend, grandfather, whatever, can they substitute effectively as a father?
Okay, so there is a difference between the divorce and, let's say, a father killed at war, or a father that... So a big factor is how does the child experience the loss of the father? During a divorce, if the father is bad-mouthed, the child feels that double whammy of, I was abandoned by the father. That's number 1. And number 2, the father is a man that is not like somebody I would like to become. Those 2 are the most hurtful combinations. If there's a father killed in war, and there's a tendency of the mother to be very positive about the father. So like Barack Obama's father basically abandoned him, but the mother told story after story of how much of a hero the father was. And so Barack's image of his father was more of a hero than the father actually was in real life, as it turns out. But that doesn't really make any difference. Image is more important than reality. And so when the child grows up without a father who's been killed but is held as a hero in the child and mother's eyes, the child does not suffer nearly as badly. The most important ground foundation reason that has the biggest impact is why the child feels the father has left. To the degree she or he internalizes it as abandonment, I did something wrong, then the child starts moving into depression and self-doubt and a lot of other negative psychological characteristics. If that is taken care of, then substitute parenting can be quite effective, and organizations, boys clubs? What are some of the organizations for boys that you have here in Canada? Big Brothers are not as effective as the Scouts and Boys Clubs, by the way. Their system has to be tweaked and updated for reasons I can get into later. Anybody else? But certainly better than nothing. Okay. On to another question. You want to do the biology question? Or you want another question first?
Well, the people there, I think, was asked a question about at what point can a father come back into a person's life and still end up being effective? I don't know.
Yeah, absolutely. Good news here. The answer is, well, first of all, the answer is the sooner the better. But the second answer is anytime. At any point in time, the child, even when a child is older, and a father says, you're old enough to understand more with greater complexity what happens now. Let's get together. So a number of things will happen. The child will spew enormous resentment at you, or the father, for having abandoned him or her and not been there during the tough years. And you've got to be there through multiple levels of resentment. But what the child is looking for is for you to stick with it this time, and for you to not give up, and for you, the child to have a chance to express his feelings, blame you, and your job at that point in time is to be there. And the message the child gets is, I'm not going away. I may not have been here earlier. I'll share with you some of the reasons as you get old enough to be able to absorb them. But and then your job is to not blame the mother to the degree that you can explain why you left without. So you've got to come up with reasons that you went away like you really wanted to be, but the minimum amount of blaming of mom is really very helpful. You don't want to do to the mom what the mom may have done to you if that's the reason you're away. If you're away from the child because you never wanted the child to begin with, that's probably one of the few things that's probably best left unsaid. And it is, by the way, a significant reason for what's sometimes called deadbeat dads, when the mother will say, I really want a child, and the father says, I'm really ambivalent about that, or don't really want a child. And then the mother says, oh, I'm pregnant, but I guess the birth control didn't work. And so the father does not feel like a partner in the process of that. So a question that was sort of said a few times in different ways here was, what can we do about this? And and how can we move? And is it cause? What's cause? What's effect? The chicken and egg process of government and the other. And basically, the brief answer to the chicken and egg question is, it is chicken and egg. The chicken, or whatever is the first, begins with developed countries becoming developed. The more a country is developed, the more it allows choices for its people. The more a country is survival focused, the more it has to keep family tight and together. So whenever there's more economic luxury, there's more looseness in family, and more permission for options, and more a willingness to do self-decision making. Micah?
Just a quick question about that. My view is almost the other way. When you have to work all the time to make money, and you're not, financially secure, you have less time with your kids. Whereas if you're more financially secure, you have more time with your kids.
Absolutely. Both are true. When you're working very hard, so for example, my dad left home at 7 in the morning, got back about 7 at night. But I always knew my dad was going to be there. I happened to overhear once my father tell relatives that he would have left mom, but he didn't want to leave mom until the children were older and I graduated from college. But that was not meant for me to hear. But my security came not from the fact that my dad was physically with me a lot, but rather that I knew that he was here and that there for me. I knew he was doing his work, his job, and that mom was doing her work and her job. But if my father had lived 50 years sooner and he wanted a divorce, there'd be almost no chance of him getting a divorce. Even when he was born in 1910, even when he grew up, the idea of a divorce was not okay. But as the more survival focused the culture is, the more the culture gives people the lack of option of having a divorce and a divorce, and that lack of option of having a divorce is reinforced by all the culture's institutions. It's religion, it's parents, it's schools, it's morality, and so on. But the issue is not really morality. The issue is really immortality. It's meaning that when a group or a culture needs to have more Catholics, more Mormons, more Muslims, whatever, then that group will create rules that will make sure that that child has no chance of just wandering away and marrying willy-nilly. But then as the culture has more luxury, Micah, the culture has more luxury, then there's more opportunity to spend more time with children, but also more opportunity to go off and create your own life and say, I want something, a life that is for me. A mother and father saying, and that's more and more permission to the culture to think in those ways as the child is older. Michael?
Sure. Just another question on that topic. It's almost like when you have a job or something like this, maybe you're making lots of money, but you're still not necessarily financially secure. And then when you make more money, then the government taxes you more. Again, it's like this incentive that parents need to work more again instead of being at home. Unless you're a business owner or something like this.
Yes, and so your point there, Micah, is what, or the question there is?
Well, like society, I mean, you say society has more wealth or something like this, but that doesn't necessarily make a family more financially secure.
Yes. Security depends on a great deal of things, including expectations. Sometimes when I'm doing couples work, I'll say, I had to imagine yourself having your spouse not produce any money at all, and you know that there's no hope or desire on their part to produce money in the future. And in fact, they haven't said, I'll take care of the children. They haven't said, I'll take care of the children. They haven't even said they'll clean up after themselves. Oh, by the way, I'm talking about the family dog. So that our expectations on our spouse tends to be much higher than our expectations of the family dog. The only thing we want from our family dog is to what? Look at us like we mean something. Look at us non-critically. And in terms of the luxury aspect of what Micah says, one of the other things I do with couples is to ask them to go back and imagine that their daughters come home, and when their daughter came home, she says, Dad, I have been keeping something from you. And Dad says, yeah, what is that? And she says, you can tell me anything, sweetie. Well, I'm not sure I can tell you this, but things have gone far enough now that I think I must. He says, I've met a man, and he's really one of the most loving, caring people I've met. Well, that's good, sweetie, that's very good. But wait a minute, he doesn't have electricity in his home. And he has no desire to have electricity in his home. And he doesn't have a TV, even a telephone, even a radio. He doesn't have a car. He doesn't, and he doesn't really want to change that. And Dad, I'm kind of embarrassed to say this to you, but he also uses an outhouse and he doesn't have any interest in changing that. He doesn't even have a flushing toilet, but he's a really sweet man. And she sees the dad almost shaking with nervousness about what to say. And by the way, this was 200 years ago, and the man that she was talking about was a king. So, and the point there being expectations that change. That we have such higher expectations now as to what we expect from somebody than we did 200 or 300 years ago. Yes, say your name.
How did men...
Say your name.
Oh, I'm Bonnie. Hi.
Bonnie, hi.
How did men who are in the situation that their wives intentionally became pregnant when they preferred not to, how do they authentically engage with those children that they feel entrapped by this situation? How do they authentically do that?
Yes. First of all, anybody ever have that experience and had some success in authentically engaging? Okay. If not, somebody's calling up with the answer. Yes, first, the most important thing that any man can do is when you choose a woman to begin with, you make sure that you do not pay for her on the first date. That you talk about Liz, what would you like to say? Well, Liz, we get to sort of know each other. We say, oh, no, would it be good for us to go out to dinner together? Not, I would like to invite you out for dinner together, but we make a joint decision as to whether we would like to go out for dinner together. Then we go out for dinner together. And that if you don't pick up the bill, that I don't just sort of pick up the bill automatically. I just say something to you, like, should we share the bill, or can I take care of it tonight and you take care of it next time? Or can I take care of it tonight, maybe you cook a dinner for me next time? So that the beginning of the process of being with a woman does not give the signal to the woman that I am your wallet. Because the moment that the woman feels that you're the wallet is the moment that the woman begins to feel like if you are a good wallet, I will be by far a bigger taxing system for you than the government could ever be, and that therefore if you are a wallet, I can get pregnant and depend on you to take care of me because you've shown to me through all of your behavior with me that you are a wallet. Now, for guys to be able to do that, you've got to be able to give up one thing. It starts with an S. Okay? And it doesn't mean you have to give it up forever. It means you have to give it up right at that first date, 2, 3 dates. You have to be willing to say, you're going to lose some women as a result of doing strategies like this. But you're going to find, so I was single for 21 years between my first and my last and final marriage, my only other marriage. And for 21 years, I used this, and I did lose the ability to be sexual with a number of women that were quite interested at the beginning of the evening. But when I, even knowing what they knew about me, this was sort of my career to think in these respects, it still was one woman who was the president of a local NOW chapter cried, and she said, Warren, I really liked you, and I absolutely know that as a president of a NOW chapter, I should be equally involved in the paying for things as well. But something inside of me feels like if you don't pay for me, it means that you are saying that you're not interested in me, and that I don't feel that you're not attracted to me. And we worked that through. But there were times when I saw other women just sort of tune out and say, I'm out of here, mentally. And so whatever agreement we came to, they didn't want to be with me at that level. And so we weren't able to be sexual that evening, obviously. But I had to be willing to be secure enough to say that, so I didn't begin to attract into my life the type of women who wanted me for the income I could provide. And by doing that type of thing, I have been able to earn enough money to support myself doing the types of things that I do, like counterintuitive thinking. But I haven't, I found a woman who would be a really equal partner with me. And so when you have women that think that way, you are much less likely to have women who feel entitled to have a child without you being a part of the process. So the big takeaway of all this is make a woman your partner from the beginning.
Deferred gratification.
Deferred gratification. The dialogue with Liz was a dialogue about what we should do, not me inviting. So I didn't start attracting somebody into my life where I said, I could take you to England because I have a speaking engagement there, you can come with me. I'm always competing. Men who are always competing to offer women things are underneath it all very insecure men. They're let me make one more point on that. The automatic expectation for a man to pay for a woman is a man compensating for his feelings of inequality. We go over that. A man automatically feeling he has to pay for a woman if he's romantically interested is the man compensating for his feelings of inequality. The more you pay me to be a consultant, the more you are saying that there's a gap between, that the more I'm valued, the less you're valued. We pay people to do to give things to us. The payment is the compensation for their time without the compensation for our value. And so when we say we automatically have to pay, that usually happens when we're interested in being sexual. That's the area where we feel they're doing us a favor. And as long as we're stuck in that system, we're going to be attracting women, the worst women into our lives and not selecting for the best women into our lives. And we're saying to the woman, I don't have the guts to think of myself as an equal to you. Women pick that up. Women see men's weakness, men who are falling all over themselves to do things for them. Women pick that up. And even though they like the attention, they also see the weakness. Bonnie?
Well, I feel that you didn't answer my question. My question is, the deed is done, man made a mistake, they got involved with the woman who entrapped him, they break up, and now there's this kid that's there that didn't ask to be conceived. Man's feeling entrapped. How can he authentically, even if the kid is now an adult, is there any way for this man and this child to authentically have a relationship? I'm just asking because I know more than one man in my life who's had this experience. Yes. It would be really nice if there were a way to make a success out of something that wasn't successful.
Yes. Okay, let's do a dialogue with that, Bonnie. Maybe if you and I are the man and woman. Okay? So let's say you've just told me that there's going to be that you're having a child and that you would like, and that I thought that I had said to you that you have birth control and you're saying yes, and maybe in the back of your mind you're thinking that I really wanted to have this child and that type of thing. So, and what stage are we at? We're in a done deal in the sense that we're.
The question I'm asking, we're in a done deal. We've got a teenager or a young person.
Yes.
There's really no relationship between real authentic relationship because dad felt entrapped.
Yes.
Dad knows that it would be positive correctness to try to develop a relationship, but he never wanted this child to feel entrapped with the wrong relationship in the first place. How is there any way to overcome this at this point?
Yes.
20 years later.
Good. What I'd like to do is a little dialogue with you, but I'm also realizing I've gone over my time, and I'm taking away from your lunch, your break time. So, Bonnie, let you and I do the dialogue right here. No, I'm sorry. I'm speaking later. Let's pick that up with a bit of power. Yeah, okay. Thanks. I'm sorry for going over.